And before beginning the presentation, I also would like to acknowledge that the draft of this paper was early discussed at the seminars of the emerging scholars organized by the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies of the University of Alberta. And also we discussed this paper at the seminar organized by Victor and Iris Borowy in June 2021 on waste and discards, and as well as at a graduate seminar for Russian Eastern European Studies scholars at Queen's University. So I'm very grateful for participants for their comments and discussions that helped me to think more about it. And the topic of my today's presentation, as Victor have already mentioned, could be seen as continuation of my ongoing dissertation project at Queen's University in Canada that is focused on materialities, consumption, and environment during the three famines in the history of Soviet Union and Ukraine that occurred in early 20s, early 30s, and late 40s. And this study is also connected with my previous projects, which were devoted to trade, consumption in Soviet Ukraine in early Soviet period. And at the time, I noticed, thanks to the comments of my colleagues and their feedback, that it is not possible to fully examine the peculiarities of consumption in early Soviet era without proper acknowledgement of the survival circumstances during the famines of early 20s and 30s. And it's similarly not possible to fully examine the peculiarities of Stalinism and the early Soviet period without focusing on the famine survival. And so in my today's presentation, I will demonstrate also the environmental connections of the famine of early 30s, famine of 1932-33, that occurred as a result of forced collectivization and industrialization of the economy. And in the series of famines of early 30s that hit several regions of Soviet Ukraine, among which were Ukraine and Kazakhstan, were one of the most hardest. And in historiography, the famine of early 30s in Ukraine, as you know, is called the Holodomor, or death by starvation. And now I will start my presentation. Yes, you should see it, right?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Victor. While studying the consumption and in early 30s period, I've noticed that interviews of those who survived the Holodomor have lots of references to environmental landscape, environmental connections. And during the time of theirs, the hungry people explored the surrounding landscapes in search for food. Or any edible items, plants, and different kind of environmental resources. Such survival practices are not unique, but rather universal for those who live on the verge of existence. In the Ukrainian case, the situation was much more complicated because of a collectivization campaign that started since 1929, when almost all grain was confiscated. Moreover, other food edibles such as potatoes and beets that comprise significant part of the everyday diet were also taken from the peasant household. Due to this reason, the connections between environment, humans, and wasted food resources manifested clearly during the time of famine. And on this slide, you can see a boy who is sitting in the place of death of his brother somewhere in the countryside. This photo collection belongs to a photo collection made by Nikolai Bakan in Chernihiv Oblast of Ukraine, and it is his son who is sitting, as I have mentioned, in the field. And these pictures were not certainly very unique, since many children died outside their villages or towns while they were looking for any edible food. in this presentation, I would like to address the problem of some methodological concerns. In these interviews, one could also come across mentions of food waste that became vital for those who left without any food or grain as a result of collectivization, or very low rationing, as it was for some social groups of urban dwellers. Waste quite recently has also become the focus of interest of scholars working in the history of Soviet Union and socialist bloc countries. And although the scholarship on waste contributes to environmental, social and economic history, it has not been at the center of also famine studies or genocide studies. And it's also almost omitted in the history of Soviet famines. And I suppose there may be several concerns for this, but the most obvious one are connected with ethical reasons. In the historiography of the Holodomor as well as other famines, the narrative of victimization and absence of the dark sides of human survival is very common. As a result, the history of famines tends to be presented in a polished way, either in scholarship or public projects, as we can see here in this slide of the recent project done in Ukraine that is presented as a, I quote, first online restaurant of memory, where we can see some dishes of the Holodomor recipes presented in a very specific, polished way, so you can see them as restaurant dishes. And when you click on the price, you can see the story about this particular dish. And I still do not know how to understand these projects properly, but I believe that when we are excluding some unpleasant stories of famine survival, famine everyday life, of those contemporaries who managed to survive those years, we are in some way distorting the memory of survivals and the events itself. In my presentation, in my research, I tried to understand and find some ways to how to represent the whole range of their extreme and traumatic experiences. And the starving people were forced to face with ethical concerns everyday life, every day, and decide whether to eat unclean or stinky smelling rotten food or not. And those who survived the famine, they kept the memories of taste and smell of rotten or spoiled food throughout all their lives. And as it could be seen from this interview on this slide, you can see like how strong were those emotions and memories about famine food experiences. Undoubtedly, also we have to understand that cannibalism and necrophagy were one of the most extreme examples of such behavior when social norms were no longer maintained. The critical view on famine food practices and consumption of food waste during the Holodomor aim to contribute to discussions on how we are studying the everyday experiences of contemporaries during the time of extreme crisis, while at the same time trying to maintain the ethical and disciplinary boundaries. It is also important to shift the focus on the environmental dimensions of famine and new meanings of nature at the time of catastrophe. And I would like also to think here not only about the case of the Holodomor or early Soviet famines in Soviet Union, but also think about how we can develop this focus for studying famines in the global context, and how can the study contribute to our understanding of survival during other extreme period of extreme crisis. As you know, in the historiography of Soviet trade and consumption, the period of 1917, from 1917 to 1922, then at the end of 1920s, early 30s, and since the beginning of the Second World War and early afterwards, are considered as the crisis modes, which have been differentiated from the normalization mode due to the extensive state control over supply and distribution of consumer goods. And many of you know the study done by Julia Hessler on Soviet history, Soviet social history of trade, where she's discussing those questions. The widespread acceptance of waste as a resource of survival occurred during the years of revolution of 1917, then during the Civil War and early post-revolutionary famine of early 20s. Later, during the 1920s, Soviet consumers were taught how to reuse or remake things, both by the state authorities' propaganda and indirectly by the constant shortages of goods. There were several crises of goods, as they were named, and the millions also of homeless people, homeless children in particular, were potentially the most well-known, so to say, practitioners of waste collection. During this time, in line with military communism, the Bolshevik ideology and the new economic policy era in the 1920s treated excessive consumer behavior as fascism. And you can see in the left side of this slide, the, so to say, anecdote from newspapers about excessive consumption behavior that were called as fascism. Also in the earlier 30s era, witnessed the rise of Soviet food processing industry, particularly in Ukraine. The real experiences with food were very different from the 5-year plans and marketing campaigns that advertised the new food assortment. And on the right side of the slide, you can see how the ideology and practice of consumption changed during these 2 decades. When in 1930s, due to the development of industry, light industry and food industry, it was now possible to have more goods and want to consume them. And now this ideological course was named as ideological pragmatism, as scholars noticed. And that's why when like people from abroad and traveled to Soviet Union, like Mendel Osherovich, an American journalist who visited the USSR in 1932, they noticed this difference between reality and ideology. Mendel Osherovich came across the large wall mural in Tulchin, a small city in southwest Soviet Ukraine. And the central message of this poster was that, I quote, as you can see on the slide, that people should not throw away their old and torn shoes, while at the same time he noted that on the street, very few people actually had those shoes that were whole. With the outbreak of a new famine in the early 30s, the intergenerational knowledge of the recent hunger of 1921 and 23 taught people how to reuse food when the organized collection of waste had become a pervasive element of everyday life. By rejecting some cultural taboos, the starving people were compelled to extend their cultural and ethical boundaries by including uncommon foods and alternative consumption spaces. In almost 1 of 4 personal famine stories, one can find a mention of usage of various leftovers as everyday famine foods, which means that extensive resourcefulness was significant advantage and essential skill for those who were living through that times. Vera Shumila, one of survivors, one of children who survived the years of famine, she is from Kharkiv, recalled a situation when, together with her friends, she collected different scraps of cheese and oranges thrown away by passengers on trains traveling south. And interestingly, that it was the exact time when the centralized waste collection were introduced in the Soviet economy. During the famine, waste became a source of vital food, and as example of above highlights, it gave children and other underprivileged social groups an additional opportunity to survive. Food waste was picked up, reused, cooked, dry, or eaten raw. Among the most widespread types of food waste were husks, as you can see on the slide, leftovers, spoiled food. And the extreme conditions of survival compelled the starving to consume also various parts of dead animals, including their skin and bones. And in the memories of survivals, we can find references to different kinds of carrion, like horses, pig, calves, and cows. Husks, which were previously used to feed the cattle, were eaten and cooked by people en masse. As you can see from this quote, to eat food waste, one had to cope with disgust and the horrible smells of rotten food. And remembering about their childhood during the famine, some respondents would tell that also treated dried potatoes, potato clippings as candies. And also I would like to say that the problem how we can understand the survival's testimonies and memories with the references to their emotions and understanding of taste during the years of famine. Their feeling of disgust is a quite interesting topic. I together with my supervisor, Rebecca Manley, we wrote a separate article on that, and maybe it could be soon available. But it's very interesting to how can we find those references to disgust in survival testimonies, because some of them try to hide their unpleasant emotions and feelings, and they're still present 50 or 70 years after these events. And including carrion into the famine diet constitutes the highest level of transgression compared to previously discussed types of famine food. The widespread death of livestock from malnutrition created masses of dead animals outside collective farms and villages. Local correspondents reported that not only did people belly swell from malnutrition, but the cattle died of hunger because neither had any food. Also, I would like to address that the topic about survival of animals during the years of famine is also a separate topic for discussion. And usually in famine studies, the topic of survival of animals is not addressed. So it could be, we can discuss it maybe later. But during the visits to the starving region, some contemporaries noticed that the use of carrion became very widespread. And when expecting one house, the authorities noted that the food they found, as you can see here, like stocks of carrion. Going from house to house, they witnessed the same picture. Peasants were compelled to include carrion, mostly horse meat, into their famine diet. And its distinctive fetid smell, as the respondents recall in their interviews, elicited strong emotions of disgust. In some cases, as one interview respondent recalled, when faced with the prospect of eating dead horse meat, her mother proclaimed that she would rather eat chaff. Also, one respondent remembers that her mother strongly opposed eating and feeding children with carrion by saying that she would rather die. I quote, she would rather die but will not feed children with dead animal. And as you can see from this quote, disgust for carrion and other types of famine foods help contemporaries to define their imaginary borders of their own humanity, and it helps them to manifest their human emotions and human feelings. What's also interesting that looking through those interviews and recollections of contemporaries about the places where they found food waste, it is possible to some way construct and reconstruct the topographies of waste. To unpack the peculiarities of human waste relationship during the famine, one has to focus on the spaces of waste and objects which became treated as food. As you can see here, as Sophia Woodward suggests, that following an object within one place, we can find and understand spaces, practices, and objects themselves. And as David Evans suggests, we can also extend the commodity chain by following this object, the object in domestic spaces. And within the framework of this research, I would like to suggest to follow the waste both within the domestic space and the surrounding environment, and look on the objects of waste both in households and in the countryside, in rural and urban areas. As extreme conditions compelled people to collect their food from previously off-limit spaces, and now they can go to some taboo places in rural or urban areas. And what's interesting that the fewer the food resources were available, the more the hungry were forced to expand their consumer practices. And this focus could also help us to shed light on both rural and urban areas, because it is important to understand that the famine of early 30s also happened not only in rural areas as it was earlier considered, but also urban dwellers survived the hunger. As a recent demographic data shows that in 1934, the intensity of human losses in the cities of Ukraine was even higher than in the villages because of malnutrition. Thus, as you can see from this slide, during the years of famine, the contemporaries created, so to say, different places of waste collection. On some of these places. Already commonly known among the most impoverished social strata, dumpsters emerged as key spaces of food sources in the topography of famine foods. For the hungry, waste sites became places where various types of food waste could be found. According to the memories of survivors, when found here, potato clippings were consumed as such or cooked together with corn heads. Unlike in pre-famine years, when urban dumpsters were usually known only to marginalized social groups like homeless or abandoned children, many more people uncovered the survival and consumer potential of those places during the years of famine. To some extent, we can speak about democratization of waste sites. Dumpsters, which were located at the village outskirts, they also attracted desperate and hungry collective farmers, peasants, and children. At the beginning of 1933, one female survivor, a 7-year-old child abandoned by her mother, recalled, I quote, "I searched for food at dumpsters. All day long, I was wandering in the fields, searching for frozen potatoes." With increasing terms of collectivization at the end of 1920s and early 30s, the course of requisition of grain, food, and livestock left collective farmers and their families without a source of survival and forced them to seek a new way. And the lack of food for animals also caused death among collective farms animals. And we can find here the information about cattle cemeteries as important waste sites for those who survived. Some respondents would not make any comments about the exterior of those places and smell, but instead they complain that it is a pity that there was not enough salt for the spoiled meat. While others mentioned the violence that occurred in those places since taking a piece of carrion from a cattle cemetery involved the need to fight for it with other hungry people. And on this slide, you can see a photo from collection of Theodor Initzer of Vienna. And on the back of the photo, he wrote that even the animals are starving at the time. And it's also interesting that the local authorities made attempts to forbid peasants to come to those places. They chlorinated cattle cemeteries, but this didn't stop the hungry people. The industrial waste of distilleries and breweries also became an alternative food resource for the starving. Reporting on the level of starvation in the Dnipropetrovsk region in March 1933, the head of local state political directorate, GPU department, pointed out that the population was compelled to eat various food surrogates, including brewery waste, which caused food poisoning and death. And speaking about food waste consumption, we can also find lots of references in sources, both in testimonies and documents of local authorities, that food waste consumption caused poisoning and death of the hungry people. In the Kiev region villages, which had their distilleries since the mid of 19th century, peasants also received pruno or braha and strained it. The dried grain seeds could be used for cooking soups and porridge, and it was also quite important food for the hungry. Also, the waste from tin yards was also used, since the workers in such lower categories of enterprises didn't get the minimal supply of everyday essentials, so their food rationing was very low. Some were caught stealing leather work, and then they would try to cook this leather at home or make some kind of soup. Moreover, plant canteens could also provide some food leftovers, as one female worker in the aforementioned vineyard used to come every day with her 4 children to the canteen and beg the diners for any leftovers, saying, I quote, "Don't be surprised, I'm a mother and I must save my children from the hunger." The construction of food processing industry also supported some hungry people, and among the new industrial spaces were dairies, which were known during the famine for their milk serum. Similarly, Belarusian starch plants became known as the topography of survival for those who were starving from famine in Ukraine. And many people traveled to Belarusian starch plants across the Dnieper River by boat or by the railway in order to obtain some starch or some waste products from this plant. The aforementioned early case of 9-year-old girl collecting scraps of cheese and oranges from the train also represent hub railways, as you can see here, and railway station became a place of hope and alternative survival space. As HBU reported, the train station were flooded with poor, vagrant people, homeless people, and children. In the south, it was reported that in May 1933 alone, more than 31,000 of people and 8,500 of children were detained at the Yekaterinska and Southwest railroads. The collected waste gave children an additional opportunity to survive. Such trains became an alternative food source during the famine. And speaking about Kharkiv, which was at the time the capital of Soviet Ukraine and one of the biggest transport centers of Republic, and important railway junction heading to the south of Soviet Union, it gave those contemporaries, the hungry, additional opportunity to find food here. Coming to Kharkiv from Rostov in 1932, Mendel Osherovich, those American journalists that I have already mentioned, was extremely saddened by what he saw at the train terminal. I quote, "There was not a single spot where people were not lying about, even though the place was damp, wet, dirty, crowded, and chaotic. Over there, you saw people camping out on tops of sacks and bundles, everything twisted on one lump, and the whole of it crawling as hundreds of heavy feet moved yet seemed to go nowhere." End of quote. The industrial and urban spaces discussed above, where waste could be collected, created a particular famine landscape. Built in the late imperial and early Soviet era, those places were considered as objects of industrialization and economic progress, part of the development of light industry and food processing industry. And it's interesting that these spaces of waste were situated close to the Ukrainian giants of industrialization, like Kharkiv tractor plant or Dnipro hydroelectric station, although they were never shown by foreigners whose trips were carefully guided by Soviet officials. Train stations were also symbols of modernization, but the famine made them places of hope, places of very of last hope, and the big train station also became places where children and adults could find some leftovers thrown away by other more wealthier groups of their contemporaries. The slaughterhouses, which were located in rural areas, had almost completely removed household animals and livestock peasant families, which can be seen as a result of collectivization. As a result, they heavily relied on the collective farms infrastructure and their waste disposal spaces. And looking at the topography of waste during the famine, we can see that the growing role of those places in the life-saving strategies of population, especially in winter and spring, being initially created for specific industrial and economic functions regulated by authorities, during the years of hunger, their social functionality was significantly expanded. In this case, I would like also to address a question: what does the history of waste tell us about the famine and the Holodomor in particular? The social transformations of early 30s and the famine per se significantly changed consumption patterns in Ukrainian and Soviet society, which consequently not only resulted in radical changes in the value of food, waste, and material objects, but they also increased the role of individual agency. And by focusing on the different spaces of waste and the different practices of waste collection, I would like also to suggest and address a very important question of victimization of famine survivals, because in some studies they are represented as people unwilling to save their lives, unwilling to do anything, but instead focusing on these practices of waste collection in particular, we can see how their agency and their willing to do anything they can in order to prolong their lives and prolong the lives of their families. And we can see here that the efficient reassignment of everyday objects during famines was a constituted part of survival strategies of the hungry. In famine, the social life of food became prolonged as the survival circumstances forced consumers to develop more informed, knowledgeable, and resourceful behavior. Different type of waste analyzed in this paper, certainly it is not the full list of different types of waste and not a full list of the places where waste could be found, but it allows us to see how they contributed enormously to the everyday diet of the hungry. The focus on waste and the various social contexts within which it can be used during the famine allows us to create a bigger picture of the famine and everyday landscapes of human on the verge of survival. Famine forced people to explore the environment, as we can see from one of the slides where a child was sitting in the field. Children were looking for any edible items outside their household and countryside. And this analysis of topographies of foodways provides us a better understanding of geographies of food searches. And we can see how people migrated for long distances in search for food. And many people also died in this process and were found on the streets and the roads. In this case, the unequal distribution of economic resources among the regions and the Soviet republics, they made many hungry people to travel to other neighboring republics, as I have shown in this presentation. And mapping connections between famine, food, waste, and environment help us to expand understanding of famine consumption practices and creates a new avenue for research in the field of famine studies, Eastern European history, and Soviet history in general. And those research also help us to find ways how to study famine food resources, food substitutes, and see more examples of life-saving strategies of the contemporaries and their food behavior and new foodways that they found during the years of hunger. I have not addressed in this presentation, but it's also important to acknowledge that looking into food waste consumption, we can also address the question of age and gender consumption practices. And also it is important to understand that speaking about waste consumption, we should also understand that food was culturally defined even during the years of famine, and it is important to understand the specificities. Thank you for your attention, and I would be glad to take your question and hear your comments.